Hi,
Hi.
welcome to Science Hangout from Science Mission. So we have today Dr. Herman Pontzer from Hunter College. He is the Associate Professor of Anthropology at the City University of New York. So Dr. Pontzer has won several awards over the last several years. In 2008, he won the Earl Suzanne Faculty Fellowship from Washington University. He also won the Best Dissertation from Harvard University Grad School of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Pontzer won Outstanding Student Paper, American Association of Physical Anthropologists Society for the Integrated and Comparative Biology. Dr. Pontzer also won Outstanding Student Paper in 2004 to 2006, that is the NSF Fellowship. He also won from 2002 to 2005 Excellence Teaching Award from Harvard University. He also has several grants to his credit and published several articles in peer-reviewed journals. Welcome, Dr. Pontzer.
Hi.
So welcome to Science Hangout. So it's nice to have you on board. Can you please
Nice to be here.
talk about yourself, your background, and some of your research interests?
Sure. So I grew up in Pennsylvania, in a very rural part of Pennsylvania, and ended up going to Penn State for undergraduate. And when I was there, I didn't know this going into it, but when I got there, I found out they had a really good anthropology program, especially biological anthropology, so human evolution, anatomy, primatology. And I ended up taking some really great classes there and got excited about trying to think about questions in human evolution research and anatomy and physiology from an evolutionary perspective. Worked in Alan Walker's lab there, especially. Jeff Kurland was also a big mentor there. And then in 2000, I started my PhD at Harvard, and I worked with Richard Wrangham first, and then ended up working primarily with Dan Lieberman, doing research into sort of form and function relationships in the human skeleton. So, for example, I was focused on asking, can we look at an animal's limb skeleton and figure out from the length of its legs and the way its anatomy is built, how efficient it will be to walk and run. And so we tested a new mechanical model for that. And that was how I spent most of my time and energy as a graduate student on that dissertation topic. That's how I got into it. I was just always excited about human evolutionary biology and the kind of questions you can ask.
And can you please talk about your mentors, supporters over the last several years? You briefly mentioned them.
Yeah, so early mentors were Jeff Kurland, a professor at Penn State, and Alan Walker, a MacArthur Award-winning professor at Penn State as well. Alan Walker's career was mostly in field paleontology, digging up fossils and analyzing them, fossils in the human evolutionary lineage. And they were both just fantastic and really great early supporters. Kind of got me tracked toward thinking about a career in research. And then when I got to Harvard, I worked with a lot of great professors there, but Richard Wrangham, who's a chimpanzee specialist, he's a field ecologist in primatology, specializing in work with chimpanzees, doing amazing work there for the last 30 years. He was a great influence on me. And also, of course, Dan Lieberman, who ended up being my primary advisor, was another fantastic influence. And he's worked on a lot of these same kind of issues of both form and function in the skeleton, how they're related, and also it's kind of taking an evolutionary view toward how the human body is shaped and built. I should also mention Andy Biewenner at Harvard as well was a big influence. He's done a lot of sort of foundational work in animal biomechanics, and so a lot of my work on animal biomechanics was shaped by his expertise.
And I know you are busy with all your writing grants, papers, and all. So what do you do when you have some time? What are your hobbies?
Well, I've got two little kids, a 4-year-old boy and a 2-year-old girl. And so they take up most of my time when I'm not working. So it's fun to play with them, but mostly I like to get outside, get in the forest or get out hiking. I used to do a lot of rock climbing and mountaineering, climbing in the Sierra Nevada, North Cascades, of course, a lot out east here in the White Mountains especially. And I still try to get out there when I can. But that's harder because it takes more time. So this last winter, I only got out ice climbing twice, which is a pretty thin season. But but when I can, I try to get out climbing.
Okay. Can you please talk about your lab, your grad students, postdocs?
Sure. Yeah, I've got a laboratory at Hunter College where I work. We are set up to do both biomechanics, including motion capture, electromyography, respirometry, kinetics with force plate work. And so that's the form and function biomechanics part of the lab. And then in parallel to that, we have a full doubly labeled water energetics track. And so that's, you're analyzing urine samples to look at isotope ratios and calculate energy expenditures, which I'll talk about a little bit later today. And so it's I've been at Hunter since 2011. And the lab has grown pretty nicely. I have to say, it's fun to go to work and work with all these great students. I've got 3 PhD students right now. 2 master's students finishing up, and 2 or 3 sort of core undergraduate students, and others who volunteer on a more sort of part-time basis. So it's a fun place to work.
I saw your recent publication regarding exercise and all. So can you please talk about more and go ahead and present your work to the people?
Sure. Yeah. So this work that you're talking about was a paper that came out in Current Biology in February. It's a collaboration with Dr. Amy Luke at Loyola University. And it's a kind of follows up on some of my early work looking at energy expenditure in humans and other primates. So I'll just jump into the presentation here, I think, and it'll be a good way to go through it. Let's see. There we go.
Yeah.
Are we showing it okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's see. There we go. The reason I'm interested in energy expenditure in general is that energy expenditure is the sort of core uniting area in evolutionary biology, because everything that an organism does, reproduction, growth, maintenance, physical activity, everything is a function of energy expenditure. So if we can understand how a species uses its energy, we can understand a lot about how that species evolved, a lot about the pressures that shaped it. And so my lab looks at energy expenditure in living humans and living apes, and also tries to sort of understand the evolutionary context and push these ideas into deep time, looking at the fossil record. When I started this work, I should just say that it's especially interesting in human evolution, this idea of energy expenditure, because if we look at the last 6 million years of human evolution since we split from chimpanzees, all the big traits that showed up in the last sort of 2 million years or so ago that I'd call this human adaptive suite, big brains, faster reproduction, increased activity, longer lifespans, all these things take energy. And so it's been this long-standing question in human evolution, is how we can fuel these evolutionary changes. So that's my motivation as an evolutionary biologist for asking questions into energetics and energy expenditure. The classic way we think about energy expenditure is something like this. So typically we think about total energy expenditure as being just some function of basal metabolic rate plus how physically active you are. So here we go. If we think about somebody's energy expenditure, which I'll call TEE, total energy expenditure, calories a day, and we can imagine how active they are. The more active they become, the more energy we expend on physical activity, PA, and basal metabolic rate's flat. So you just have this increasing relationship between activity and TEE. And that's what I'd call the additive model. It's the standard model that we have in public health. It's also very commonly used in primate and hominin ecology. And there's another piece of this, or sort of a consequence of this idea, modeling, is that since BMR here is known to be a function of body size, if we think that an animal's energy expenditure is mostly a function of its body size and kind of constrained by body size, then there's been this other way of thinking about energetics and evolution that's evolved, that's developed, which is this idea that if we have now, imagine these dots are each a different species. If we know that species' body size, we'll know a lot about its total energy expenditure because of how body mass and BMR are related. And so you see this idea crop up all the time in ecology and evolution. It's this idea that, total energy expenditure is a function of basal metabolic rate, which is just simply a function of body mass. And so your total energy available to do all the important things in your life are just a function of your body size. If you spend more energy on one thing, you've got to spend less on another. It's a sort of trade-off framework. Okay, we had some data and some findings developing in the sort of 1990s, early 2000s, which were beginning to question whether or not this is really how it works. And so a lot of my work has been kind of looking at that question. And the paper that in February in Current Biology gets to just this exact issue. So that's where we're heading here. Okay. I just want to talk a little bit about how we measure energy expenditure, because it's important to know that we're doing it empirically. We're actually measuring quantitatively the amount of calories that an animal's burning. And the way we do that is called the doubly labeled water method. So you'll see a lot of estimates of total energy expenditure in different papers, but unless you've measured it with doubly labeled water, you haven't really done it quantitatively. So the way DLW works, doubly labeled water, DLW, you take some water that's enriched with deuterium and oxygen 18. Of course, water is H2O, so if we put some isotopes of O and isotopes of H in there, we can basically enrich this water with isotopes that we can use as tracers. The isotopes are totally safe and non-toxic, but they allow us to track the movement of H's and O's through your body. So we dump that into your body water. If it's an ape, we just have them drink it. If it's a human, we can just have them drink it. Some studies with other species can inject it. It's however you want to get it into the body, it's fine. And then over time, as the animal urinates and sweats and breathes out water moisture in its breath, you lose the H's and O's as water. But you also lose the O's as CO2, right? So now we have a difference here. We're losing both isotopes as water. We're only losing the O's as CO2. And what that means is if we compare the loss of O2, loss of the oxygen 18 isotope versus the deuterium isotope, we can get some measure of CO2 production. So here's sort of how it looks. We have urine samples from early in the experiment, then a little bit later, a little bit later, a little bit later. This is about a 2-week period. So every couple of days we get these urine samples. We'd see that the oxygen isotope enrichment is being lost faster than the hydrogen. And the difference there tells us how much carbon dioxide you're producing. You can't produce carbon dioxide without burning calories, and you can't burn calories without producing CO2. So it's a pretty direct measurement of how much energy you're burning. And that's a measurement that we do in the lab here at Hunter College. I'll mention that the data that we had in that Current Biology paper in February, this was all done using mass spectrometry by Dale Scholer's lab at Wisconsin. He's a leading pioneer in this method, and he's the one. His lab is the one that did all the work for that Current Biology paper. But we also do this sort of work here at Hunter College. All right, so we've worked all over a bunch of different populations at this point, a lot of different species here. But just to give you an idea of both how we can apply this method, but also how I kind of got into this question about how energy actually works, I'll focus first on a study that we did with Hadza hunter-gatherers in northern Tanzania. So until we did this study in 2012, we didn't have any measurements of total energy expenditure in hunter-gatherers. We had a lot of data from Western populations, from cities, and not just Western, but all from developed countries. And so we didn't have any measurements of total energy expenditure in this hunting and gathering lifestyle, which is the lifestyle in which our species evolved. So we wanted to understand what that was like. And so we went and lived with a Hadza for a few months. Wow. And this is work I did with Dave Reichlin and Brian Wood. So here's a typical Hadza camp. This guy, he's about 65 years old. People live to be 70 or 80 years old pretty commonly there. Here's a Hadza house, right? They live in these grass houses out in the middle of this kind of dry savanna. And their lifestyle is very much a very traditional lifestyle. So women are gathering plant foods out of the wild plant foods every day. Men are off hunting wild game every day with bows and arrows, or they're climbing trees and chopping into the trees to get honey. So what he's holding there is an axe. It's more like a hatchet, but we call it an axe. That they climb up into the trees and chop into the limbs to get the honey out from the inside, because bees nest in the trees there. So it's all wild foods, no machines, no guns, no vehicles, nothing like that. And it's a very active lifestyle, right? It's very physically strenuous to do this lifestyle. And I'll just also mention, the Hadza know about the outside world, and they interact with outsiders pretty regularly, but they just prefer their own ways. They prefer their traditional ways. So they're proud of the way that they like their lifestyle, so they maintain this lifestyle. And that means that they become this invaluable resource for anthropologists like me who want to understand what this lifestyle is all about. So we did a few things with that study. We measured calories per day with doubly labeled water. We measured activity with GPS and heart rate. We measured walking costs and resting costs using respirometry. I'm going to talk about the calories per day here. So these are the data that we published in 2012. We were sure, right, going into the study, we thought they'd have really high energy expenditures. But what we found is that actually they're not so different. 1,900 calories a day, 2,600 calories a day for women and men. And when we plot that against data for Westerners, so US and European, but this would be the same in Japan or anywhere, Mumbai, any urban setting. If we look at fat-free mass versus total energy expenditure, women are the open circles, men are the closed circles here. Every dot here is a person. And we lay the Hadza over top, they're exactly the same. No difference at all. So, and that's no matter how we look at this, control for this, whatever, they're all the same. And that was a real surprise. Of course, we expected them to have high energy expenditures because they're so active.
Yeah.
We didn't. If you look at this way, similarly, no difference. And this is some more recent data, but no difference between the Hadza and Western men when we look at population. So every dot here is a cohort, is a different population. Okay. So how can it be that there's no effective lifestyle on total energy expenditure? This project with the Hadza got me thinking about maybe a new way of thinking about a new hypothesis for total energy expenditure, which I'm going to call the constrained total energy model, constrained TEE. And that's this idea that instead of going up in a straight line fashion, with like the additive model expects, sometimes people call it the factorial model, we might expect that total energy expenditure is constrained, so that even as you're more and more active, your body fights very hard to keep total energy expenditures more or less fixed. And so there's actually some interesting data for this. There's a project that was done by Klaus Westerterp in '92. He looked at took people who were really sedentary, and he had them train to run a marathon. And every few weeks he would increase how much they were running. So they would run, first they're starting out with nothing, then they're running 20 minutes a week, then they're running 40 minutes a week. They did this over the course of a year. And from 0 to 8 weeks, they went from very sedentary to running a bit, and their energy expenditures went up. But we'd expect then for their energy expenditures to keep on going up and up and up as they incrementally increase their training. Instead, this is what actually happened. Right, their energy expenditures plateaued as they got more and more active. Flatline, nothing. And so I looked in the literature to see if this is something that's common across species, not just humans. And sure enough, if you take that same kind of experimental approach and you take animals and you make them work harder and harder for their foods, these are all experimental studies in different species, and the x-axis for all of these is physical activity. The y-axis for all of these is energy expenditure. And you can see that no matter what, across the board, there's just these flat lines in total energy expenditure, even as species are pushed to be more and more and more active. This one kind of exception here is interesting. These animals increased their energy expenditure on a per kilogram basis, but actually they ended up losing so much weight that their total energy expenditures were still lower at the end of the experiment. And it's the only time that anybody's even seen a per kilogram increase in energy expenditures. So this seems to be a pretty common response across animals, that you sort of defend your total energy expenditure the same way that you defend body temperature or blood glucose levels or any other kind of homeostatic set point. Okay, so that's a lot of background, but it gets you understanding where we were with this current biology paper that came out in February. Because this is all experimental work. This is all take an individual and have them ramp up their energy, their physical activity, and see what happens to energy expenditure. But we still didn't understand necessarily what happens when we look across populations, right? We look at normal daily life outside of these experimental changes. So the MET study, Modeling the Epidemiological Transition Study, is a big study that's run by Amy Luke at Loyola Medical School. She's the PI, fantastic researcher, fantastic to work with. And this project is interested in a lot of different questions having to do with transitioning from rural to urban and less developed to more economically developed lifestyles. But one data set they have is they have this doubly labeled water data set for 332 individuals. That's a lot. It's a big DLW study. And they also have physical activity measurements using accelerometry. So those are little motion sensors that people wear so we can know exactly how active they are. And so we can compare then total energy expenditure against physical activity. And this is a nice normal daily life kind of study that lets us look at a big broad range of variation in activity. Here's what the data look like. And so this is from that paper, that 2016 February paper here. And this is adjusted total energy expenditure. What is it adjusted for? Well, bigger people burn more calories. Different locations can end up having effects on energy expenditure. So we control for those things in the model. And what you're looking at here is total energy expenditure adjusted for those size differences. And across the bottom, we have physical activity measured by these accelerometry counts, those motion sensors. And what we found is that, on the bottom end of activity, we do get some increase in energy expenditure. But then, after about 200 counts a minute, which is sort of right in the middle of our activity levels that we recorded, it's a flat line. So the yellow line is this best fit, lowest regression. This gray line is what happens if you just fit a simple linear model through there. And that's important too, because that says, look, if you don't think about the shape of the curve, if you just make it be a straight line with a simple linear regression or something like that, you're going to see a significant positive relationship. But that's driven entirely by the people here on the bottom. Out here, the curve really flattens out. Here's another way to look at this. What we did is we looked at the effect of physical activity on energy expenditure, and we asked how the effect changes as we get higher and higher into physical activity. And if we just focus in just on this bottom range here, here's this effect size. So what we're asking here is, how big of an effect does physical activity have above a certain level of activity? And if you get, here it's almost 1 calorie per day per every movement measurement. But by the time you get again to the sort of middle range of activity levels, you drop to 0, which is to say anything above 200 counts a minute, which in our study is right in the middle of average activity levels. As soon as you get there, there's no longer any effect on total energy expenditure that we can measure. So for these 112 individuals in our study, so more than 30% of them, there was no effect of energy expenditure, no effect of activity on energy expenditure for these guys. Okay. So that was the big finding, and it has some big implications for how we think about energy expenditure and how we think about the relationship with physical activity, health, that kind of stuff. And what I thought I would do is just show you quickly kind of how that we can take this and both think about it in terms of evolutionary medicine, but also in terms of evolutionary biology.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, sorry. First, I wanted to just talk about what could possibly be going on here with the mechanism. So here we have total energy expenditure in this top range, resting metabolic rate here in these light gray, and activity energy expenditure here in red. So this should be, activity energy expenditure should be the energy that's being spent on physical activity. And we see as you get more and more active, it also flatlines above this sort of moderate activity level. So somehow the body's compensating. We don't really understand yet exactly how that's happening. We're still in the hypothesis phase and testing phase. But in general, there's two general possibilities. One is people could behaviorally change. So they fidget less, they sit instead of stand. Those sorts of changes behaviorally could save you energy, and they wouldn't get picked up in our accelerometer, which you wear on your hip, on your waist. The other possibility, and this is exciting, is that you might reduce physiological activity in other parts of your physiology. So you might reduce immune function, you might reduce reproductive activity, that kind of thing. And there's some evidence for this. If we look at, for example, studies that have looked at women who go from being sedentary to exercising, they do see a change in things like estrogen levels, which suggests that the reproduction system is responding to this activity change. So some suggestive data from other studies here, but of course it could also be behavioral. And of course, there's no reason it couldn't be both working together. So this is early days, and we're trying to figure out and test these different models and ideas for how the body compensates to higher levels of activity. Okay. I'll just finish up by talking about some of the evolutionary implications here and how we can rethink about how this all works. So there's no clear effect of lifestyle on activity in TE. That suggests that total energy expenditure is this evolved trait that the body is trying to keep in check. So we can think about it like this, instead of like our previous linear model. We can think about it more, energy expenditure and activity more like this. And that would suggest that there's some evolutionary set point that our body's trying to maintain. What's kind of cool about that, and then you could also imagine that there might be some optimal range of physical activity. If you're down here, this is sort of not normal for you, and perhaps you're spending more energy than you need on immune system and reproduction, that kind of thing. But if you're up here and you're way too active, perhaps you're cutting into those vital tasks, and that could be reasons that people develop things like overtraining syndrome. So this is, again, sort of speculative, but this is the implications of this constrained model. The other question would be then, okay, if this is an evolved set point, then how does it evolve across species? In other words, maybe this isn't some fixed relationship between body mass and total energy expenditure. Maybe instead we have a lot of variation here that we haven't been looking for yet, that we can appreciate. So I'll just wrap up talking about some of that work. We've actually measured total energy expenditure in a lot of species now, not just this Haza study, but a lot of collaborators and I have looked at primates all over the primate family tree. And what we found is really cool. So first of all, primates here only burn half the energy you'd expect for a non-primate mammal their size. So these are non-primate mammals, different groups you can see here. The trend line is in gray. And this is log space, so you kind of lose how big of a difference this is. But the red primate regression is actually 50% lower than the non-primate regression. So it's a huge difference. Primates have these really, really low metabolic rates. Humans here are just like other primates in that regard. We have really low metabolic rates compared to other mammals. And what's also cool is that there's no difference between captive and wild populations. And that actually fits exactly what we'd expect for a constrained model of total energy expenditure. And then another interesting piece of this is work that came out in 2014. If we take, we know that primates have really slow life histories, which is to say they grow really slowly. Primates reproduce really slowly. That's true for humans. That's true for monkeys. It's true for other apes. It's true for a lot of all primates. And so the way we can visualize that is if we look at growth rates for non-primates in gray versus primates in red against body mass, you see primates reproduce slowly, we grow slowly. If you, instead of plotting this against body mass, we plot this against estimated total energy expenditure. In other words, if we take into account the idea that the fact that primates are burning only half the calories you'd expect and say, well, then what does that change in terms of predicted life history? We collapse a lot of that variation so that now primates basically look like everybody else. In other words, their low total energy expenditures account for these slow rates of growth and reproduction. So that's exciting. That tells us that evolution might push metabolic rates around as a way of achieving changes in life history and changes in paces of growth and reproduction. And so just to think about, what this means, if total energy expenditure is this evolved trait and not just simply BMR plus activity, then we have to think about maybe how physical activity mediates allocation of energy to other functions, and ecological implications for that. Another thing we can say for sure now that primates and humans and other primates, I should say, are really low energy expenditure mammals. Kind of accounts for primates' really slow rates of growth and reproduction. It also means we kind of have to rethink some of these established models in life history. Not that the models are wrong, but maybe they're incomplete. Maybe we can add to them and think about how we can improve them. In terms of evolutionary medicine, it has big implications for how we think about physical activity, obesity, metabolic disease. It suggests, for example, that obesity would be due to gluttony, not sloth. In other words, if weight gain is fundamentally some issue of taking more calories in than you burn off and getting out of balance in terms of energy in versus energy out, well, our work is suggesting that the energy out part of that equation is fixed. You can't change energy expenditure very much with changes in lifestyle. And so that means that we're getting out of balance because we're taking too much energy in. And, we need to account for that when we want to try to tackle obesity. It could, though, however, also tell us about why exercise is so good for us. And I just want to make the point, you still need to exercise. People have taken this work, and including that February paper in Current Biology, and they say, oh, well, look at this. There's no reason to exercise. But that's absolutely not true. And we never say that, and we're very clear in the paper. And whenever we talk to people in these sorts of opportunities, we always make sure to point out there's lots of good reasons to exercise. It's good for heart health, immune system health, brain health, aging well. There's so many good reasons to exercise. Our work doesn't change any of that. It just says that we also have to focus on diet, and especially obesity, particularly obesity, might be a public health issue that we can tackle best with diet rather than exercise alone. And the last thing I'll say is that stay tuned, because this evolutionary approach to thinking about energy expenditure has given us some really cool and surprising results, thinking about human evolution specifically, and those results are coming out soon. So I think I'll wrap up there, and if you want to talk about the data, that'd be fun. Yep.
Can you please
change my screen again?
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go. Right. This is very interesting. So it has a lot of implications, as you suggested. So I have a few, which you brought up at the end, regarding the exercise and all. Does it mean that, I'm talking in terms of layman's thinking, okay, does it mean that, you don't have to do too much of exercise? If you do too much, it doesn't have much effect on your energy expenditure.
That's right. If you're already a pretty active person, if you're already, maybe you walk or bike to work, or maybe you're taking the stairs instead of the elevator every time, trying to get some exercise a couple times a week, if you're already physically active, then, increasing that activity level so you're exercising every day, hours a day, and really, really pushing it really hard, that might be good for your health. That could have some good effects on heart health and that kind of thing. But we wouldn't expect it to change the calories that you're burning per day. We'd expect your body to adjust to that new level of exercise and keep your energy expenditure more or less the same.
Okay. and which holds true good for obesity, right? Like if you basically you cut down on what you eat because you don't need much of that whatever you are eating for your day-to-day energy expenditure.
Right. Yeah. This adds to, there have been studies pointing this way before. This is not in itself a new idea. We know that diet has a bigger effect on weight than exercise does. So this is just a nice example of how and why that probably works.
Yeah, one of the things, like I'm from India, so what used to happen is my mom, she's no more, but like she used to almost like fast every day, every other day, or something like that.
Wow.
I mean, like it is kind of a religious thing.
Okay.
But that I think she lived till 80. She didn't have, like, she had little bit of heart problems, but like she took some medicine. That's about it. No medicine, no nothing. So I mean, like she used to, like I used to see. Okay, then when I saw your paper 2 months ago, I said, oh, okay, there is something is happening there which we don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, like for whatever reason, she's exercising for a religious belief, God, and all those things. But that helped her in terms of maintaining her health because you don't need to consume so much.
I mean, I think again, you should exercise. We should all be exercising. We should all be physically active. But that's not the only thing, right? Diet's the other big piece of this.
Yeah.
And the old saying is you can't outrun a bad diet.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. This is just more evidence of that issue.
Okay. Yeah, it's really nice to have you on Science Hangout. I really appreciate you taking time and join us, and look forward to seeing more of your nice work.
Well, thank you very much. It was fun to talk with you, and thanks for the opportunity and time to share the work and talk with you and everyone about this stuff.
Yeah, and I would love to see you more. Like if, as you mentioned, you will have something more, like certainly feel free to shoot me an email, like you want to discuss more. Like people would love to see this kind of work, and that really helps them to, like, whatever they are doing in their day-to-day life.
Sounds great.
Thanks again.
You bet.